Welcome to the Rise Inside podcast, hosted by Justin Starbird and powered by Rise Robotics. Listen as host Justin talks to experts from the Rise team about topics relating to mechanical engineering, industrial design, commercialization, and innovation. True collaborations work when ideas are integrated at inception to solve significant problems. Rise Inside brings together how the team continues to work with great folks to commercialize ideas. You're listening to the Rise Inside podcast. Here's your host, Justin Starbird.
Welcome back to Rise Inside. My name is Justin Starbird, and this morning I am fortunate enough to be joined by Gunnar Gillespie, a senior analyst at FedTech. Gunnar, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Hey, Justin, appreciate you having me on.
Hey, happy to have you on. Ken and the Rise team have shared a lot about you and about FedTech. To kind of catch me up to speed on what you guys do. For our listeners out there, tell me a little bit about FedTech and the companies that you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. So FedTech was founded back in 2015, but we really hit a lot of traction in this deep tech space, I'd say about 3 years ago. My background before FedTech is I kind of came from like a biotech background, worked at a small VC firm and worked with a lot of like pre-seed pharmaceutical medical device companies. But I started FedTech like 2 years ago, and we were still like a very small firm there. I was one of the first analysts hired. In the last, I guess, 2.5 years, we've grown to about 40 employees, and really just kind of ballooned in the federal innovation space. I'd say in particular, we have 4 things that we do. And the nuance to everything is that we're not an investment firm. We don't take equity stakes in any companies. We don't have a fund. Basically, we provide program support and services related to technology entrepreneurship. And the kind of flavor of everything we do is deep tech. So we don't work with any like wishy-washy Uber platforms or anything like that. Everything we do, and like one of the core components of Rise, I guess, is like the technology differentiated, highly innovation bit of it. Like I'd say like the average R&D time of the type of thing we work on is probably like 3 to 10 years. Really long lead times. So we work with quantum hardware, networking devices, like advanced AI, ML hardware, just everything. But anyway, there's kind of like 4 components of what FedTech does, and the way we got started was with our startup studios, and that's basically where the government spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year on R&D, and a good chunk of all that technology they create and all those labs just kind of sits there in perpetuity and forever, kind of like trapped within the minds of the inventor, if that makes sense. Yeah. And what we do is we go through the portfolio of a lot of these labs, and we find the things that have the highest commercialization potential, working with the inventor to understand what their vision was. And then we go pull together a team of, 3 random people with a coach. We teach them how to incorporate it as a business, and how to be productive and find their value proposition and do stakeholder discovery and all the things that it takes to run a company. That's our startup studio program. So we've run a bunch of those, and created, I think, probably close to 200 teams now, and a lot of them have incorporated and gone on to raise millions of dollars and introducing their products to the world. So that's a good chunk.
So you offer support in that realm, and put the people in place to help them commercialize. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we essentially run the program pretty much start to finish. So the recruitment of people that want to be entrepreneurs, the selection of the technology, and then assisting with the kind of like licensing process. Like a lot of it is like, how do you properly run a startup? And it's very intensive, very hands-on. A lot of the early stuff for folks that have never done it before, it's like it's like you can have like assignments in it. Everything is very tracked and kind of like metrics driven, as with most of our programs. And I think I saw Ken with the question there about who funds the process. So generally, these are sponsored by the entities that have a stake in federal innovation. So like Ensign and NASA and all these big organizations that do a ton of R&D. They're helping us select the entrepreneurs and the technology and run the program.
Sure. So almost acting as if you're a de facto, tech transfer office, no?
Essentially, it's like, yeah, tech transfer on steroids, maybe, because
Yeah.
we're quite literally creating it's a very systematic approach to creating teams that incorporate as companies. So it's a volumetric, like it's a volume-based approach to tech transition.
Sure.
And obviously, with any deep tech venture, there's, various probabilities of success depending on all kinds of things. Like there's millions of reasons that startups fail. But we take like almost an engineered approach to mitigate the highest chances of failure. And that's, making sure that there's good product market fit, and making sure that you understand your customers' needs, and making sure the team has a good dynamic, and all the things we can control in the process of creating a company. So,
Well, you did mention that there is a 3 to 10 year lead time with some of these projects, having just begun in 2015, and as you said, getting your stride in the last 2 or 3 years.
mm-hmm.
You must be just starting to see some of the fruits of the early labor, no?
Yeah, and that's the thing with and I'm sure it was kind of similar with Rise, but like a lot of these technologies, some PhD in some lab was working on for like his entire career. It came out of his dissertation, and he worked on it forever and ever and got funding for it. And it's really just the cutting edge of what's possible out there. But he doesn't have the business acumen. He doesn't know what it like how to even commercialize. And so we just bring people to him or her that want to like do that essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so like the lead times for the programs are usually like less than a year. That's what it takes to recruit and pull together and train and form teams. And the inventors involved every step of the way, and there's coaches and mentors and all that. But that's our startup studio program. That's kind of like one chunk of FedTech.
Okay.
There's another chunk, and that's kind of what Rise is involved with here, and that's our accelerators program, accelerators programs. And what we essentially do is we work with companies to increase their traction and success in really whatever way is most beneficial to them. And so I've I've been run and involved with probably well over a dozen at this point, kind of start to finish programs, primarily with the Army, some with the Department of Energy, some with the Air Force, a lot of different things. And like we've worked with a crazy range of companies, everyone from, 2-person founders with $0 to, 100-person companies with, $500 million and billion-dollar valuations and whatnot. So an accelerator is like, how do we take a cohort of people with such a diverse set of expertise and push them in a direction that's beneficial to all the companies as a whole?
That is incredible. So where you're at today as a senior analyst, what is your role in, working with all of these companies?
Sure. So I kind of like started out as a program assistant, helping create bespoke educational modules, help research and find and vet mentors, and help with client briefs and whatnot. And I moved on to a program manager role where I was, led a team of a few folks to execute these accelerators, interview all of the companies, understand their specific needs, work with our clients, figure out who the defense primes are in their specific area that they need to be subcontracting to, all these things. And my role now has moved more to a program advisor thing where I'm working across 5 or 6 programs at any given time, and working with their program managers to ensure that it's at the quality and the mark that we want to hit for our clients and specifically for the companies we work with.
That's awesome. So, you must really enjoy coming to work every day, because you get to, it must change every moment.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. So like, we've been working with the Army since X-Tech Search 3. So we've been through 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 4 cohorts now, each with 10 or 20 companies. So in the last 2 years, I've gotten to work with about 60 of the best companies, dual use deep tech companies in the United States. Everything from, quantum hardware companies that started out from Nobel Prize winning technology, all the way to, PTSD diagnostics and treatments that are, still in the preclinical stages.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I get to scratch the like technical itch that I've always had of like wanting to know as much as I can about everything. And this is like an amazing way to do that. But, also from a professional development standpoint, the ability to interface with that many unbelievably qualified individuals and provide something valuable to them. It's a crazy opportunity.
Absolutely. And, I just look at some of the different companies that you had a chance to work with. And, obviously now being part of Rise, you have this X-Tech Accelerator program. Do you want to dive a little bit deeper into that for us?
Yeah, sure. And I think it would help to understand the X-Tech search program as a whole.
Okay.
And just a kind of asterisk here, FedTech, we support the Army Research Lab and ASALT's initiative with the X-Tech search program. So we're not involved with the judging. We don't select the companies. We don't facilitate the competition. We don't award any funding. We're an add-on to the program to help the companies because X-Tech Search 1 and 2, they had this, big competition. They select a bunch of companies, they award a bunch of money. And at the end of the day, the companies really still didn't know how to do business with the Army, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Why would a 3-person, founder team of some small tech company with like a few $100,000 and, no knowledge of the DoD, like that's, what are they supposed to do? They don't know anything basically.
Right.
So we're starting
working with the government is its own business altogether.
Oh yeah. And so, yeah, we have to, we essentially we get the top companies from the X-Tech search program, and everyone has a varying level of expertise, right? So I'm sure Ken remembers this, but we had an hour-long entrance interview where I asked them really specific questions like, what is your understanding of how procurement and acquisition works? And if we can get a good pulse across the whole cohort of what their knowledge is in specific areas and what their needs are, then we can develop a bespoke curriculum for them. So, understanding if they're way past certain points as a whole, we don't have to, cover certain topics. We can create new ones to address, problems that they're recently having. The whole thing's customized to each cohort.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so, as you jump into the accelerator, how were you introduced to Rise?
Yeah, so essentially, we had seen them in the semifinalist portion of X-Tech 6. So I know there were about, I think, 60-ish companies in there. And I think I remember I had maybe an office hours session, or I had seen Ken on a few of the webinars before. And I was definitely excited to see them kind of make it as one of the finalists here, as one of the top 20 companies. And so I saw them on the list, and, our process of reaching out to everyone and getting the entrance interviews ready to go. That hour-long meeting with Ken and Aaron was kind of the first touch point I had with Rise. And they're really kind of a good example of like the quintessential like deep technologies startup, if that makes sense. Okay. Just because it's obviously an MIT-led innovation, which is like how half these things start, coming out of the foremost universities. And then the second bit of it is it's quite literally just like taking a system that has existed for a long time because it's the status quo and has, no particular reason to be that way, and just disrupting it with something totally new, using new kinds of engineering and new kinds of material sciences to augment it. And so it's kind of like the definition of how to pursue innovation. Take old things, start from ground zero, first principles, build it up to something that has like, that's really entirely new.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was cool to see that.
It was awesome. And, we've been close to it for a while. And given your overview of the deep tech, ecosystem in general, mm-hmm. Where do you see Rise fitting in?
Sure. So it's I'd say, let me think of like a pie chart of like the deep tech ecosystem. So there's all these big buckets, right? And I kind of define deep tech as anything that's difficult to do and requires a lot of money and timelines. And, Rise is going after and accomplishing not an easy feat. Like hydraulics have traditionally been around. I think, I remember watching a lot of your pitches for a long time. And I'm sure you guys have talked about this a lot on the podcast, but, completely disrupting that system is kind of like the definition of something deep tech related. But it fits right into that bucket of, hardware related solutions that can have a sprawling impact across the ecosystem and can kind of like drastically increase the performance and value and quality of advanced systems. it's kind of like the most important functional piece of how a lot of equipment works, and obviously it's built on really strong principles, how it works in the first place. So it's just scalable to whatever kind of thing you need it for. We talked about our priorities related to the Army and the DoD more broadly, and we're helping them pursue understanding what their options are there and how that works. But more broadly in the commercial space, and we work with a lot of dual use companies. It's funny. I've seen I've probably worked with dozens of companies similar to Rise, but in totally different kind of areas. FedTech spun out a smart tire system. It's a totally new way of designing a tire. Just augmenting existing systems drastically by using first principles engineering.
And you mentioned a term that I've heard several times from previous guests, dual use. Can you give us your definition of dual use?
Yes, dual use. I mean, I guess the term literally means using in two different contexts. For Rise, I guess that there is two different contexts, and the context here is the commercial space and the private markets, and that's kind of just the everyday thing that people think about. And then the other side of things is the more public markets, and that's where you have the government, the Department of Defense, and Department of Energy, and all the the federal funded things and whatnot. So the reason a dual use company, I think part of the reason a lot of companies are dual use is that they are both developing products that are appealing to both of those markets. Mm-hmm. And specifically with deep tech related products, they take a long time, so they obviously cost a lot of money too. It takes a lot of money to engineer complicated products. And the Department of Defense and more broadly the federal government are the biggest investors, bar none, in the whole entire world in technology. It's not even close. It's really not even close. And so a lot of companies, and I imagine Rise may have been in that boat too, were born from federal dollars. And so it's kind of they have that, they're born from the mission statement to give back to the public,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so as as FedTech being a bolt-on to some of these things, and being a support mechanism, how do you work with companies and continue to support them and see them through to success?
Sure. So during the duration of our accelerators, we have our core pillars, and that's essentially, a hyper focus on education, complex topics like how do you subcontract on an IDIQ, how does Army acquisition work, how do requirements writers evaluate technical solutions, all kinds of things like that. Something that the average founder would have zero insight to, and is absolutely required to do business with the Army, because you have to first see the map of the map of the beast you want to navigate, and then you got to speak the language. And without either of those two things, you can't even have a start because you don't know what you're doing. And so that's what we start with. And then we have a big mentorship program, where we recruit mentors from kind of all over the place. Generally, one's from the Army, one's from the industry, and one's kind of an entrepreneurship expert. And they work with the companies over the duration of the accelerator with a specific agenda. We also do some community stuff where the founders get a chance to talk to one another. Obviously, they have very unique experiences and they've learned a lot of things, so it's important for them to share. We do a lot of one-on-one work. That's the kind of venture building we do. That's where, all our FedTech employees have a pretty diverse set of expertise, and we have a lot of program advisors as well that are very smart cookies. And so when companies need something really, particular, that's where we can bring in an expert to work with them. And then the last bit is the strategic exposure. Obviously, the pursuit of the Army as a customer requires a lot more than just your company. A lot of times you're just an integrator. You're going to be subcontracting out whatever you have to a much larger system. And so, in bringing in primes, and the other side of things is how do you pay for all this? And it's, bringing in the capital providers that can help with that. And then, the last bit of strategic exposure is how do you know that you're satisfying a real need in the Army? And that's where you get end user feedback, and that's what we plan on doing, I think sometime in March with the 75th Innovation Command. we'll work with their reserve unit folks and try to, give the opportunity for companies to get feedback from a lot of end users at once, right from the source.
How long does a typical engagement, last? When do your, skills, kind of transfer over to the company and you guys say, you're on your own, we've done everything we can?
Sure. So the accelerator usually lives alongside the competition. So we'll work with this group, I guess it would have been late November through March, so kind of 5-ish months there. I typically prefer to run programs that are longer, just because a lot of times the information is really dense and it takes a while for, first you got to understand it, then you got to digest it and kind of think about it for a little bit, and then you got to be able to use it. And that doesn't happen overnight, obviously.
Sure.
And then the other thing is just when you're working with the government, you're working with entirely different lead times, right? If Rise wants to disrupt, one of the next big, like, I guess, acquisition systems that utilize, these kind of like lifting tools that they engineer, there might be a 2-3 year lead time on that contract that they need to start, pulling together. And so success is often baked in during the accelerator and then seen much after the fact. And that's why it's tough. It's tough to, it's tough to point to something when it has such a lag time to it,
Sure. So what's next on the horizon for FedTech?
Sure. I think what's really important and a personal passion of mine, I guess the reason I work at FedTech is because I see how impactful a lot of this technology can be. And so anything I can do to increase the probability of success, even, a single percentage point for, the dozens of companies I get to work with on an annual basis is a win in my book. And so when I think of how do I, from an objective standpoint, how do I increase that? It just means broadening to more programs and more companies, because what we've created is essentially, scalable traction for the companies we work with, particularly with the DoD. So I'd love to see us, work more closely with the Army and the Navy and the Special Forces community. And, we already work with a lot of them in some respect, but, there really are thousands and thousands of incredible companies out there in the U.S. And, we want to be able to have a small part in the success of each of them, because it is a very difficult endeavor to found, run, and have success as a deep tech company.
Absolutely. Well, Aaron and the Rise team are inspirations for a lot of the MIT graduates and other guys that are in the boat that they were 10 years ago. If they want to get involved with FedTech, how do they find you?
Sure. So you can just visit us at our website of fedtech.io. Right now, we don't work particularly with startups directly. A lot of times we work through programs that we're running from a corporate standpoint or the government standpoint. But if you want to get involved, we always have events where we'll bring in really VIP speakers to talk about certain topics. We have a whole entire mentorship program that's a fairly light lift. It can be an hour, once every couple of weeks, where, you'll be introduced to a CEO of another company and then a few other mentors as well. And, you'll help them work through their strategy and whatnot. And then, if you, let's say you just, say you started at MIT and you sold your company and, got a nice paycheck and now you're really bored in retirement and you wanted to do it again, you can go be an entrepreneur in one of our startup studios and select the technology you want to spin out next. That's a possibility as well.
Awesome. Well, Gunnar Gillespie, Senior Analyst for FedTech, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Cool. Appreciate it, Justin. Thanks, Gun.
You have been listening to the Rise Inside podcast, presented by Rise Robotics. On behalf of our guest today and host Justin Starbird, thank you for listening. Please share your feedback on our LinkedIn page, linkedin.com/company/rise-robotics.